Madam Chair, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Representative Massie.
Thank you, Ranking Member Comer, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I anticipate today's discussion and testimony will involve the U.S. patent system. And so in this opening statement, I want to read the patent and copyright clause that's in the Constitution. This clause was so uncontroversial that it was accepted by all of those who were drafting and voting on the Constitution unanimously and without debate. It says, "The United States Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing, for limited times, to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries." So some people who haven't studied this issue too much think that perhaps patents are the reason that drug prices are high, but the reality is on a lot of the drugs, the patents have expired, and there's no restriction from the patent office to keep somebody from making these generic versions of the drugs. But there are other impediments not involving patents that stop these generics from coming to market. So I hope we find out what those are about. And then I also want to say that our founding fathers were really smart here. They knew that if the owner had a limited period to recoup their investment, if the inventor and the owner, then they would be able to find the capital and the backers to develop these ideas and discoveries. So even if you had scientists who would come up with new drugs for free, let's say they just gave the idea away, these new drugs require millions, hundreds of millions in some cases, of development in order to bring them to market. And without a patent, which is the equivalent of a deed, like a deed to a piece of property, nobody would develop a piece of property if they couldn't get a secure title to the property. Patents work the same way. They allow the investors to get secure title to the idea so that they can then invest the money that's required to bring that to market and to test it and make sure it's safe for all human beings. So I look forward to a robust discussion on that, and with that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Trudeau, you mentioned that Mallinckrodt was a manufacturer of generic drugs, and that was a big part of your market in the beginning. In general, what % of prescriptions in the United States are generics?
I believe it's approximately 90% at this point.
So 90% of the prescriptions that are written and filled in the United States, roughly, are for generic drugs. I think that's fantastic. But is the cost of generics in the United States significantly higher than in other countries? How do we compare when you go on a generic label?
Well, typically the United States generic market has been amongst the most efficient, meaning that prices drop most rapidly in the U.S. We have a very efficient market. And generic prices typically, in a relatively short amount of time, many times within a year, drop to about 10% of the branded price. So we have a system that works from a generic perspective, certainly relative to other countries.
And what are some of the challenges you face when you want to make a generic drug, say after a brand name drug goes off patent? What are some of the hurdles that you have to overcome to get a generic drug to market?
Well, the primary thing that you have to do is generate bioequivalence data. So you have to demonstrate that your product is bioequivalent to the branded product. That requires some clinical work. Sometimes it requires other investment, research and development investment. And then, of course, you need to be very efficient from a manufacturing and distribution standpoint because you're competing in a very aggressive competitive marketplace.
Is there something that we can do in Congress to make it easier to get to a generic label from a brand name label after a drug goes off the patent?
I believe the generic environment today is actually quite good. I think there's been significant improvements on the regulatory side in improving the throughput of generic approvals. I think the statistics show that the FDA has generated significantly more approvals of generic products over the last couple of years. That certainly adds to competition, and that's certainly likely to drive down prices.
And in order to produce a generic without infringing on a patent, the patent has to expire I suppose, but can you also license the patent, or is that not typical in the drug industry?
Certainly, it could be done, but that's not typical. Mostly, generic products enter the market after the expiration of patents.
And what is the lifetime of a patent?
Well, a patent can vary, but the lifetime is typically going to be on the order of 20 years, but recognize that's from the actual discovery itself, and much of that time frame is actually taken up by research and development. Many times when you launch a branded product, you may only have a couple of years left on the patent because most of that time has been eroded because it's taken time to develop the product. So, typically it's 20 years. It can vary a little bit, but that's typically the time frame.
So that's 20 years from when the invention occurs, and like you said, sometimes you're only left with a few years to try and recoup the investment. How many of the drugs that you develop actually result in a profit?
Well, that's on the generic side. Typically, you're likely to be reasonably successful because, again, you're not driving innovation necessarily, but what you're doing is you're driving down costs because you're able to bring competitive products to the market. On the branded side, it's a little bit different. On the branded side, I think the likelihood of success while you're actually driving innovation is dramatically lower. We've heard some statistics, that 1 in 100 or so drugs ever makes it to market. That's probably in the range. It's a high failure, high risk environment when you're developing any kind of new innovation, as we all know.
Thank you. I've got a few questions for Mr. Bradway. Mr. Bradway, you talked about the sort of, I don't know if you used the word convoluted, but it seems convoluted to those of us who aren't in the industry and trying to understand the drug pricing schemes and how it involves pharmacy benefit managers and rebates. Can you tell us roughly what % of the money that my constituents spend on drugs or the government spends on drugs for my constituents goes to pharmacy benefit managers, Mr. Bradway?
Yes, I can tell you that the intermediaries in general, which include the PBMs, have about 46 cents on every dollar in the pharmaceutical industry. So 46% of what you see as the U.S. drug industry reflects revenues that go to the intermediaries, including the PBMs.
So that's almost half of the drug price that the consumers pay or the government pays goes to an intermediary instead of the drug company?
Or instead of directly to the patient, that's correct.
And when my constituents pay their copay on a drug, you mentioned that there are rebates that are paid. Do the rebates go to my constituents? Who do they go to?
Thank you for raising this question, Congressman. I think this is important for you and your constituents to appreciate. The copay is a function of list price, and the rebates are also a function of list price. So as list price rises, the rebates to the intermediaries rise as well. However, the other consequence of raising list price is that the patient at the pharmacy counter is having to pay a copay off now a higher list price. And the discounts that have been given to the intermediaries are not provided at the pharmacy counter to the patient. So we've wound up with a situation where the intermediaries are getting the rebates and not directly transferring that benefit to the patients. So the intermediaries are seeing their share of the pie increase while asking the patient to reach into their pocket and pay more in the form of copay. Again, that copay is not collected by the innovative industry. That copay is collected by the intermediaries in the system.
So the copay, because of the way that the pharmacy benefit managers work and the other intermediaries, the copay that my constituents see, or that check that they have to write out, or sometimes they have to borrow the money for that copay isn't based on the actual price that goes to the drug company or the final price that the drug company receives for that drug. It's not even based on the real price of the drug once you count the rebates. It's based on a higher effective price. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's absolutely right. Your constituents are paying a copay, again, which is a fraction of the list price, and The innovative company is receiving what's known as the net price, which is the list price minus the rebate returned to the intermediaries. And in the United States, the estimate of the rebates alone approximately $150 million. But as I said earlier, 46% of the dollar is in the hands of the intermediaries.
Madam Chairwoman, do I have time for one more question? Okay. So can you explain to us, Mr. Bradway, what the intent was when we came up with the pharmacy benefit manager system, what the intent was and how it was designed to make drugs more accessible or a lower price, and how that mission has possibly wandered over the years?
Sure, Congressman. I perhaps might point out two things. First, the structure of the rebate system that I'm referring to is one that was created by legislation that enables us to interact with the intermediaries in a way that includes paying them rebates in order to secure formulary placement for our medicines. But, again, I don't want to just point the fingers at the PBMs. I think we heard in Mr. Trudeau's testimony one of the useful functions that the PBMs have played in our system through the years, which is helping convert patients to generic drugs when they're available. It's one of the reasons that we have 90% of the prescriptions in the country being written for generic drugs. I think the question, however, is whether they're playing an appropriate role when it comes to innovative, brand-protected innovations and designing formularies that separate the physician and the patient from one another at the pharmacy counter, where patients can't be sure that they're going to be able to walk away from the pharmacy with the medicine that their doctor intended them to have because of the structure of the rebate system that's in place in our industry.
It feels like to me, just in closing, we need some kind of truth in pricing here. If people bought cars this way and the actual price of the car wasn't what the consumer paid, and the financing was based on a price that wasn't the real price, I think we'd be outraged. So maybe that's something we could look into, and I thank the chairwoman for her indulgence, and I yield back.